Welcome back to Wounded for War. We're shifting gears this week. Last week, if you watched the video, we were talking about a new direction, and it's happening. We have prayed long and hard about things and tried to figure out. There was a stirring in our hearts and trying to figure out what's going on. Where's God leading us? And you know, as someone who's trying to lead a new movement, not church as it was, but more of a looking at this disruption of COVID and life being shut down as an opportunity to shift gears and to reanalyze what we did, what we were doing as a church whole, you know, just looking at the model in general and kind of asking ourselves, is this what Jesus would have if he was here today? And I was convinced that it wasn't, and there was a stirring for a long time, and then this was just seemed the right time to shift gears, and not just shift for the sake of shifting, not just change for the sake of change, but for a while now there's been this sense that we've gotten off course. There's been this sense that the church isn't what it was meant to be, that it doesn't look like the bride of Christ, and it doesn't look like Jesus in a lot of ways. And I don't want to just pick on it for the sake of picking on it. That's too easy, to be honest with you. But instead, what I want to do is I want to share with you basically what I think is going on, is that this disruption in our own lives was meant to make us think, was meant to make us analyze, are we on the right track? Or did change need to happen anyhow? You know, a lot of people are okay with the status quo. Leave things, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But the truth of the matter is, we really have to analyze things when they're going well and when they're going bad. Any business owner would tell you, if they only analyze things when it's bad, well, then it's too late. You want to analyze what you're doing right when it's good, and then you understand how to carry forward. It helps you carry a vision forward properly. And so to analyze the bad would just be to look at the church today in some sense. And there's some good to analyze too. But if we want to go to the purest sense of what to analyze when it's good, to go back to the scriptures, to look at what was happening then. And by the way, there's a whole book written about the same type of scenario. And so today, I actually want to dive into the book of John. We're going to shift. That's our new direction. We're going to dig through the book of John and see what's going on there. And the reason why I say that that's pertinent to this time that we're in and season where life is disrupted is because in the book of John, what we're going to see is John is dealing with a very certain circumstance in his own day of disruption. You see, Christianity had rolled out. Jesus had come here, lived for 3 years doing ministry, shared with his disciples how to live, how to do ministry. They didn't just hear about his message, but they watched his message lived out. And what happens is, over time, like many things, the purity of it starts to wane. It starts to change. People start to disrupt its own purity. In that time, it was the Gnostics, it was the Pharisees, the Sadducees. They're adding things and subtracting things from the message that Jesus had left with his disciples. And the Gnostics were a group that in particular said, hey, the way that Jesus taught was fine and it was great and he was a good rabbi, but if you want to be a super Christian, there is more you have to do. Or the Essenes said, hey, there's less you have to do. So they were disrupting in their thinking. They were, all of a sudden, new Christians coming in were getting this distorted view of who Jesus was. And I think that's pertinent to today. That this disruption, this COVID-19 that's changed all of our lives, that made us kind of come into a recluse time in our own life where we sit down and analyze, am I doing everything that I'm supposed to be doing? Am I doing stuff I shouldn't be doing? Is my life where I want it to be? Am I happy with where I'm at? And the church is asking the same questions as well. We're being challenged, all of us are being challenged to think, what does it look like going forward? How do I have my best life now? But also, how do I have my best life planned out for the future? Am I on the right path? Am I doing the things that are going to lead me to the places I want to go? And in John's time, while he's finding this church getting disrupted and these thoughts and processes that weren't a part of the message all of a sudden start infiltrating, he finds it necessary to share the gospel again, though there's 3 written already. It's the story of Jesus. The good news is what the gospel, the word gospel means, good news. So he wants to share this good news, but what he wants to do is he wants to reiterate that it's good news, and he does it from a specific vantage point. What he does is the other 3 gospels take their message from the beginning of the man Jesus, or even 2 of them take it from, let's say, John, one of the other books takes it from Joseph's origin, one takes it from Mary's origin, one takes it from like Abraham's origin, going up to Jesus. But in this case, in John wants to remind you that Jesus is not just a man, that he's divine in nature, that he's God in flesh. And so he goes all the way back. He goes back to the very beginning of the origin of time. In the book of John, chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, and yet the darkness did not overcome it." So John goes back. He goes back to Genesis 1, the very beginning. There's darkness, and God says, "Let there be light." And by the way, it's notable that, in the beginning, there's reference in Genesis 2 people there. As he's making man, he says, let us make him and them in our own image, right? And so it's a plurality. There's clearly more than just one person creating in that moment while they're there, and that would be speaking of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Maybe you've heard of those 3. Jesus Christ is the Son. In this case, that's who John's addressing. In the beginning was the Word. Now, I know you're thinking, why the Word? Why put the word in there, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with, and the Word was, and the Word. It seems odd. Why wouldn't you just say it this way? In the beginning was Jesus. And Jesus was with God. And Jesus was God. Wouldn't that make it so clear for people? And it would seems so logical. But in the time that this is being written, don't forget that there's a context. And the Greeks in this time, who John relates to quite a bit, in this moment, John's writings are going to be read by the Greeks and by the Jews. And he wants to clear it up for everybody. So the readers, because there are going to be Greeks here, he's going to write in ways that both can understand. And for the Greeks in this case, they were used to this word. They knew it as logos. And it referenced a spoken word or a thought. And so what they're saying is, in the beginning was this spoken thought of the Lord. The beginning origins came from something, and it was a creator. They're referencing that there's more than just an object. If there's an object, then there must be someone who created the object. And that's what they would have understood this differently than we do today. He says he was with God in the beginning. And then he says, basically that beginning point was all things were created through him. So he was before everything. He was before all things that are created that you and I see. And apart from him, not one thing that was created. And then he takes it from creation to life. And he says, in him was life. And that life was the light of men. So in him was the very essence of what makes, you might hear the birds chirping in the background, the trees that are growing behind me. And most importantly, though those objects that are back there are beautiful and they're gorgeous, especially in the state of Washington where I'm at, but in particular, he says that he was the life, and that life was for men. It says in him was life, and that life was the light of men. That life that he has gave a light, a brightness, a goodness to men. And that's plural. I mean, or neuter, I should say, in nature, in that it means men and women. It's just the terms they talked about back then, but it certainly means to all people, all humanity, that God, that Jesus was the very essence and nature of what gave you and me life. We were the ones that brought nothing to the table, and he brings everything to the table. He gives us the very life that we have. That's what it's speaking of. And that light shines, so that light that he brings shines in a dark world, in the darkness, and yet the darkness did not overcome it. In the original Greek, when it says that the darkness didn't overcome it, it also has the tone and tenor of that it didn't understand it. That for some reason it didn't understand the goodness and the greatness and the strength and the joy that comes from light and life. So John makes his theological pact statement up front, and he wants us to get the nature of who Jesus is, that he's from the beginning, that everything we have is from him, and that anything that's good about that, or good that we gain from that, or that we are from that, is that it comes from him. That's its source. But it also says that we didn't quite understand it. Because I'm dark in nature, you're dark in nature, let's face it. Left not from our words, but in our minds, left to just that, we know how dark we are. We have to fight that, right? Which tells you that there's two forces fighting against each other, light and darkness, good and evil. And in this next section, it says in verse 6, it says, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. God is so good that even though we wrestle with darkness and we can't quite defeat that darkness in and of ourselves, he sent a messenger to let everybody know about who he is and what he's about. And I love that John is very upfront about his motive, his directive, and it's found right there. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that, here's his motive, so that all might believe through him. Through who? Jesus. That everyone would come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. That's why he writes this book. It's a different message than the other guys in a sense, because he wants people to believe in Jesus for who Jesus is and what he does as a creator of all things, as the one who sustains everything that we see. If he took away his goodness, if he took away his light, if he took away his life, we would have nothing. There would be darkness and abyss all over. John wants the readers of this, the Jews of that day, the Gentiles of that day, the Greeks, and even us today. He wants us to understand the source of who we are. And that actually brings out something great. And he starts in the next section in verse 9, and he says, the true light that gives light to everyone that was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created through him, and yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. He's the giver of life. And in this case, what he's referencing back to is more of what the Jews might relate to in that day, because Israel was chosen by God to be the people that Jesus would come through into this world. He gave them the stories, right? Through Moses, he had the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And it gave this story of how God would be coming back to redeem his people, and that he was a good God and a good father, and one that would protect these people from all things. And yet constantly the rest of the Bible seems to show how they missed it. And you think, how could they do that? You know, I was sharing with someone earlier today how if someone had told me, hey, here's your future wife, but they only gave me half the picture, right? And it was kind of blotchy. There was parts missing. Maybe the lips weren't quite there, and I saw an eye, but maybe not the other, and some of the hair, but not some of the other. And it wasn't a full picture. And I start looking around, and I'm looking, and I'm excited, but I'm filling in the voids with my own thoughts, my own ways of what I think she might look like. What happens is I could easily miss her, right? I'm filling in those parts, and I'm gonna kind of put in my own preferences. I'm gonna put in my own likes and dislikes, and I'm gonna fill in those voids. But what happens is the image isn't what it was meant to be, and so now I've created a distortion where I won't recognize her when I see her. And that's what happened. You see, they were given a clear picture of what was going to happen, but then they kind of filled in those voids. Well, we want to be redeemed. Well, I'm your redeemer, God says. But they want to be redeemed from the times that they were under in that moment. They were being ruled by another people, and it was Roman occupied territory they were living in. They thought, hey, we need a king that's going to come like a conqueror, and he's going to take down the regime that's against us. And so they were filling in some voids, but Jesus didn't come that way. John wants to remind them that, hey, you missed him maybe because you were looking for the wrong thing. Maybe you filled in some voids. Maybe you've done that. Maybe I've done that. We've looked at what's the meaning of life, and we've looked at where are we going? Where's this leading? Is there a God? What does he look like? And then we kind of take our own wants, desires, fears, and we create a God based on that. Shoot, whole religions are built on that. And in this case, I kind of want to go back. John wants to take us back to understanding who he is. And so that's why we're going to go through this whole book verse by verse and just take it apart with the idea of understanding who is the person of Jesus. What validates him? What makes me want to worship him or understand him or even love him more? In this next section, verse 12, it says, "But all who did receive him, he came to them, or gave to them, the right to be children of God. To those who believe in his name, who were born not of natural descent, or of the will of flesh, or of the will of man, but of God." So he says, anyone who did come to him and received him, he gave them the right to be kids of his. So anyone that wants to come to Christ, notice that he's not cliquey. The church is cliquey. There's other groups that are cliquey. He's not cliquey. He says, but to all who receive him. He's all inclusive. It's often said that Christianity is one of those things that where there's a certain group and they don't want to let you in, and unless you fit in, unless you fit the mold, unless you look the part, unless you say the right stuff. But the truth is, he says, man, anyone who comes to me, I'll give you the right to be my own kid. Not to be a part of the trial basis kid. No, he just moves you right into being a child, one of his own kids. And I think about that, and that's a pretty awesome statement. Like, I'm going to let you in, and I'm going to let you in if you want to come in, and not just at a level where I'm testing you out and I can boot you out, but he says, I'm going to let you be my child. That's a term of love, of care. And that might shake you a bit right now. If you're like me, man, your childhood maybe doesn't have the best memories, right? And so you just hear that you're going to be a kid of a God, and it kind of scares you because you wonder, what's that parent like? I hope that parent's good. And you probably drag into that thought a bunch of things that shouldn't be there. We're filling in pieces again, and we don't want to do that. So let the Bible fill in the pieces of who God is, so that we can wipe that fear off. We can wipe some of those bad visions of who a parent should be. Let's look at him for who he is and judge him where he stands on his own merit alone. And notice that it says, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of natural descent or of the will of the flesh. So what does that mean? It means that we're not naturally grafted in, and it's not by my will that I could muster up some strength to be his child. Oh, daddy, let me be your kid. That's not what he's saying here. And instead he says it's not even by the will of man. Now that part, if you're into theology, is called predestination, and a lot of people trip out about that. And a lot of people, it leads people down rabbit trails that say basically, well then it negates the first part, that all people could come to Christ if they wanted to. This would kind of intimate that basically it's God choosing you. But the reality is how do you know if God chose you unless you choose him as well, right? If I receive him, then he receives me, is basically the way I read that. Hey, God says, hey, don't worry who chooses who first. Don't get stuck on that theology of Arminianism. God, that's a hard one. Or Calvinism. Both are opposing in nature. One stood so strong on one side, the other stood so strong. It's man who chooses God. No, it's God who chooses man. And they kind of got landlocked so tight, and then they started making up their own theology built off that thought and off of this thought, and they became at odds. And now you got two children of the same father fighting. How stupid. Instead, I like the way Charles Spurgeon says it. Why do I need to reconcile the two as enemies when they're actually friends? God knows who will choose him one day. Otherwise he wouldn't be a God, all-knowing, right? He knows who will choose him, so he'll choose you back. He knows who won't choose him, so he doesn't need to choose you back. That's the way I look at it. Simple. But more importantly, the last part is what we should get stuck on, not the other parts. Basically, it says, if you receive him, he'll give you the right to become the children of God, and it's from God. Why is that important, that it's from God? Because it reveals that he loves you, that he cares for you, that in your worst hour, maybe right now you sit back and you think, man, I have not done anything good. Why would he want anything to do with me? It's not because you're good, it's because he's good. It goes on to say the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We observe his glory, the glory as the one and only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. Do not miss that. Do not miss that. The Word Jesus himself came down and became flesh and dwelt among us. This is God who was up in the heavens, who did not need to come down here. He could have just done it another way, but because he loved us so much, he came down here willingly, became vulnerable as a baby, decided to live among us, understand how we live, understand our culture, understand what sorrows we go through, our pains, our joy, what brings us peace, what takes away peace. He wanted to get in the mud and the dirt with us and to really wrestle through life so that when we wrestle, he understands. He gets it. The Bible also talks about that, being a father who has compassion or sympathy for his kids. Notice, he says, he became flesh, dwelt among us. We observe his glory, the glory as the one and only true Son of the Father. But what does it say next? Full of grace and truth. Both the Father and the Son are reflected in that statement. And it says full of grace and truth. Grace, unmerited favor, unearned favor. You don't earn God's favor. You don't earn Jesus' favor. The whole point of Jesus coming down was because he was going to be honest with you about your condition, but also he was going to go up on that cross and he was going to hang there and he was going to take the penalty for missing the mark. The word for missing the mark is sin. It's an archery term. We've talked about it before. We think of sin today and it sounds so ugly. It's like, oh, that's known by judgmental Christians, isn't it? But all it means is to miss the mark. Look, man, I sin with my wife all day long. I miss the mark every time, right? And we don't get bugged out over that. But yet when it's tied to Jesus, all of a sudden we go haywire. But do we not realize that grace, unmerited favor, you don't have to earn a dang thing from him. He's full of truth. He's going to be honest with you of your condition, but also of the fact that he paid for that condition so that you could be in a right relationship, even as jacked as you are, as jacked as I am. He allows us to be back in a right relationship. And then he doesn't just leave you there because he is full of grace. He actually not only saves you by grace, but he saves you from your sin by grace. He changes who you are over time by grace. Full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him and exclaimed, "This was the one of whom I said, the one coming after me ranks ahead of me because he exists before me." Now that's interesting because if you know the story, John is Jesus's cousin, and he was born 6 months prior to Jesus. So why is he saying because he exists before me? You see, his own cousin is the one who's referencing right now that he was from the beginning. And this is just another time where he's pointing back to that origin of before time began, Jesus was. He believes it in every way. He's putting it in every nuance that he can. He goes on in verse 16, he says, "Indeed, we have all received grace upon grace from his fullness. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the one and only Son, who is himself God, and is at the Father's side. He has revealed him. There's a lot of people that believe the Old Testament God was an angry God, and the New Testament God is this loving, warm and fuzzy God. Well, that'll be destroyed soon as we go through the Bible, because we're going to see Jesus go into a temple and flip tables, and if I may use the term, he's a badass. He goes in and he flips tables, he gets pissed off, he goes off on some people that deserve it. And then on the other side of the fence, God the Father, though he was oftentimes looked at as this, gnarly dude, judging, and that's all, he's up there with a big rod and ready to knock you down. There was times in the Old Testament where we saw him pour out grace and mercy on his people, even in the worst times. In this, I love that it starts with, indeed, we have all received grace upon grace. Grace heaped on top of grace. Unmerited favor on top of unmerited favor. Love upon love. This, grace upon grace, it says, from his fullness. And then he contrasts, he says, well, the law came from Moses and grace came through Jesus Christ. It's not that one season in the Old Testament was a law and therefore the God of that law was gnarly and bad and the new one's good. It's just that the same God who loves you gave you an understanding of yourself. You can't understand good or even perceive what good is unless you have something to contrast it to, and that's evil. And we can't know that we're evil unless we have a set of rules that we could break. And so he says, hey, I'm going to give you a set of rules. Here's 10 simple rules. And like man does really well, we make it 613 laws in the Jewish laws. And they said, hey, we're going to expand on it, and we're not going to keep it. We're going to break it. We're going to make a mess out of it. And that's what happens because man isn't good at keeping laws or rules. And you might think right now, I'm pretty good. I'm better than most. Can I be frank with you? When there was only 2 people in the world, Adam and Eve, 2 people, a male and a female, they couldn't even make a good choice. And you got all kinds more. I have all kinds of more distractions in life. We think we're going to do better than them. They missed the mark by making one bad choice, and they ended up outside of heaven, the Garden of Eden. We find ourselves in the same situation, but the beauty is that, like I said before, in this case, this law showed us that we had a need for a Savior. And the beauty is that he threw that grace upon grace through the person and work of Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the Father, the one and only Son, who is himself God and is at the Father's side. He has revealed him. So when we look at Jesus, we see the Father. It says that it pleased the Father to send Jesus up on that cross. Why? That's brutal. Because he gains you. He knew that he would get Jesus back. It would be a temporary suffering. So it wasn't wicked or evil. But he knew that he would get both. He would get Jesus back and he'd get you, get me. The people that didn't quite ever measure up. But he loves you enough that he wanted to pay a price for you. He wanted to show you how wicked you could be, but how merciful he could be. And the beauty of that is you become more loving towards that. You're not a spoiled brat. You actually appreciate your parent, your Father in heaven. That's enough that we're going to cover today. We're going to take off from there next week. We'll jump into chapter 1 of John, verse 19, and we're going to move forward into more of who Jesus is and what the Bible has to say about him and how it relates to our life. But one of the things that I'd love for you to ponder on in between now and then is COVID, this government shutdown, this life shutdown, it made us all think, are we on the right track? Are we analyzing our life? Are we slowing down enough to check and see, am I where I want to be? Am I who I want to be? Have I consumed, many of us just asked, have I consumed enough life and goods, and am I happy with what I got? No one's ever happy enough with what they got. You'll see someone with the new iPhone, you want that. You see someone with a new car next year after yours, and you want that. It's not about consuming stuff, it's about who you are. And so my question is, for myself, I had to ask myself, am I happy with the results of who I've become? I'm 47 years old. I don't have many years left. I'm on the downside of the slope, and when I think about that, I think to myself, no, man, I want to become more gracious, more loving, more kind, more gentle. Honestly, more like the person I see in Jesus. And so I would say, ask yourself during the season, are you who you want to be? Has life measured up to what you want it to be? Well, as you analyze that and think through it, come back next week as we discuss more and look ahead at the book of John and realize how he starts to influence other people's lives, and where he takes a person. He's going to take some guys out of their occupation, out of their norm, and he's going to move them into a whole new life. So please join us next week as we look at that. It may be something you're interested in. It may be something that reshapes where you're headed. Thanks for being with us. I love you, and see you next time.